The wind here never stops. I want you to understand that before anything else. This is not wind like you experience in most places. The kind that comes and goes, that you notice when it's there and forget when it isn't. This is the Nebraska Sand Hills wind, a constant, sustained, directional force that comes off the high plains from the northwest and moves across the landscape every single day of every single year with the relentlessness of something that has been doing this for 10,000 years and intends to keep doing it for 10,000 more. The first week I was on this property, the wind blew the door of my truck out of my hand 3 times. It blew my soil sample bags across the field and into the fence line. It dried the surface of exposed sand to the consistency of powder within 48 hours of any rain event, making it ready to move again at the first strong gust. The previous owner, a rancher who had run cattle on the surrounding ground for 30 years, looked at my 38 acres of wind-exposed, degraded, sandy soil and said, "You can run a few cows on it and not much else. The wind won't let you." I looked at that same wind and thought something different. I thought, the wind is not the enemy, the wind is the constraint. And constraints have engineering solutions. Before we go any further, drop a comment right now and tell me where you're watching from. Your state, your country, wherever you are. I read every single one because I want to know if any of you have dealt with wind like this. Land where the wind is the thing that stands between you and what the ground could produce. Tell me where you are. I want to hear your story, what the county soil survey revealed about the specific erosion history of this 38-acre parcel, going back to the 1930s Dust Bowl, is something that explained everything about why the land looked the way it did when I arrived. Stay with me. The Nebraska Sand Hills cover approximately 19,000 square miles of north-central Nebraska, the largest sand dune system in the Western Hemisphere, stabilized by a continuous cover of native grasses that hold the sand in place with root systems that can penetrate 8 feet into the dune structure. The sand hills are not a desert. They receive 18 to 20 inches of annual precipitation, enough to support the native grass cover that makes the whole system stable. They are, under that grass cover, one of the most productive ranching landscapes in America. The key word is under. Under the grass cover. Remove the grass by overgrazing, by tillage, by drought, by any of the ways that human agricultural practice disrupts the native vegetation, and the sand becomes mobile again. Within a single wind season, exposed sandhill sand can migrate in ways that reshape the landscape visibly. The Dust Bowl years of the 1930s left scars on this specific part of Custer County that the county soil survey maps still document. Blowout areas where the sand was mobilized, dune faces that shifted, native grass communities that were set back by decades. My 38 acres included 3 such documented blowout areas, places where previous agricultural disturbance had broken the native grass cover and the wind had done what Sand Hills wine does when given exposed sand to work with. The blowouts were partially healed. 20 years of reduced disturbance had allowed some grass recovery, but the cover was thin and the sand below was still mobile enough that any significant disturbance would restart the erosion cycle. The surrounding land was native grass rangeland, managed carefully by the neighboring rancher who understood the sand hills and ran his cattle at densities that the grass could support without damage. He had watched my 38 acres degrade over the years before I bought them and had made one offer to purchase and been refused. When I bought instead, he came over on my second day. He was a quiet man named Virgil. He looked at the blowout areas. He looked at the degraded grass cover on the exposed southern and western faces. He looked at the wind moving across the bare sand in the areas where the cover was thinnest. "Hard ground to work with," he said. "Yes, sir," I said. "Wind'll take anything you expose." "I know," I said. He looked at me. "What are you planning?" he said. I'm going to stop the wind first, I said, then farm what's behind it. He was quiet for a long moment, in the particular way of Nebraska ranchers who are processing an unexpected answer. Nobody's tried that here, he said. Nobody's needed to yet, I said. The windbreak design I'm about to describe, and specifically the specific species combination that a University of Nebraska extension forester told me was the most wind-resistant configuration for Custer County conditions, is the foundation of everything that came after. This is the part nobody tells you about. Stay with me. Stopping wind is not the same as blocking it. This distinction is critical and misunderstood by most people who plant windbreaks for the first time. A solid barrier, a wall, a dense single-species hedge, does not stop wind effectively. It deflects the wind upward and creates a zone of turbulence on the downwind side where wind speed actually increases as the deflected air descends back to the surface. A solid barrier is, in some wind management contexts, worse than no barrier at all. An effective windbreak is permeable. It slows the wind by allowing some air to pass through it, reducing the velocity gradient between the windward side and the leeward side gradually rather than abruptly. The research on windbreak effectiveness from the University of Nebraska, research conducted specifically on sandhills conditions, showed that the optimal windbreak design for this region produced wind speed reductions of 40 to 60% on the leeward side, extending to a distance of 10 to 15 times the windbreak height. I hired a University of Nebraska extension forester named Marcus to design the windbreak system for the 38 acres. He spent a morning walking the property, measuring the prevailing wind direction at multiple points, assessing the existing vegetation, identifying the blowout areas and their relationship to the wind flow patterns. His design was a 3-row windbreak system running the full length of the northwestern boundary, the windward face from which the prevailing northwest wind arrived. The outer row, eastern red cedar, a dense evergreen that provides the structural density of the windbreak at the ground level where wind velocity is highest. The middle row, Siberian elm, a fast-growing deciduous species that reaches height quickly and provides the upper canopy of the windbreak structure. The inner row, native sandhills plum, a low-growing native shrub that closes the gap between the ground and the first row's canopy, preventing the wind from undercutting the windbreak at surface level. 3 species, 3 layers, each addressing a specific gap in the wind management system. Marcus also designed a secondary windbreak running perpendicular to the main system along the southwestern boundary, creating an L-shaped protected zone in the center of the property where wind speed would be reduced sufficiently to allow production. "What do you want to grow in the protected zone?" he said. "Everything the sand hills doesn't normally grow," I said. He looked at me. "That's ambitious," he said. "I know," I said. "The day I planted the first eastern red cedar in the Custer County sand hills, pressing a root ball into sand that had been moving in the wind for decades, is the day I understood what it means to commit to a decade-long investment before you can harvest a single thing from it. Stay with me." The windbreak planting happened in early April, the optimal window for bare root tree planting in the Nebraska sand hills, when the soil moisture from snowmelt is still available and the wind has not yet reached its summer intensity. Marcus supervised the planting layout, and I had arranged for a crew from the Natural Resources Conservation Service, the federal agency that has been supporting windbreak planting in the Great Plains for decades, to assist with the installation. 140 eastern red cedar trees, 80 Siberian elm, 60 native sandhills plum shrubs, planted in 3 rows across the full northwestern boundary, with the secondary row along the southwest adding another 60 trees and 40 shrubs. Each planting hole was dug by hand, the sandhills soil so light and loose that a spade went in without effort, which would have felt promising if I hadn't known that the same looseness that made planting easy was the same property that made wind erosion possible. The root balls went in, The trees were tamped, mulch rings of wood chips went around each trunk, and then the wind tested us immediately. A sustained wind event 3 days after planting, gusts to 52 miles per hour, toppled 11 of the newly planted cedar trees and blew the mulch rings off every planting in the outer row. I spent the following day resetting the toppled trees and staking every outer row cedar with a single bamboo stake and a figure-8 tie. The stakes held in the second wind event. The trees held. The first season was a survival year for the windbreak, not a growth year, a survival year. The young trees put their energy into root establishment rather than height growth, building the anchor that would allow them to resist the wind in future years. At the end of the first growing season, the tallest cedar was 18 inches high. Virgil drove by in October and looked at the windbreak from the road. "Awful small trees," he said. "They're establishing," I said. "Going to be a few years before those do anything," he said. "Yes, sir," I said. He was right. It was going to be a few years. What the University of Nebraska range management specialist told me about restoring the 3 blowout areas on this Custer County property, and specifically the one technique that she said nobody uses because it requires patience that most people don't have, is the technique that made everything else possible. Stay with me. The 3 blowout areas were the most vulnerable zones on the property. The places where wind erosion was still active, where sand was still mobile, where the cycle of disturbance and erosion had not yet been broken. Restoring them required a specific sequence that I had to understand before I touched them. Dr. Elena, a range management specialist from the University of Nebraska's Custer County Extension Office, walked each blowout with me and explained what was happening in each one. The sand was mobile on the exposed faces. The moisture was insufficient for grass seed germination without protection. Any disturbance of the thin existing cover on the blowout edges would expand the mobile area rather than contract it. "The sequence matters more than anything," she said. "You cannot seed before you stabilize. You cannot stabilize with plants before you stabilize with structure. Structure first, then biology. Structure first." I installed erosion control blankets across the most active blowout faces. Biodegradable jute fiber mats staked into the sand surface that reduced wind velocity at the ground level to below the threshold for sand movement. Not forever, just long enough for biology to establish. Into the protected zones beneath the erosion blankets, I seeded a specific native grass mix that Dr. Elena had designed for Sand Hills blowout restoration. Little bluestem, side oats grama, sand bluestem, and prairie sandreed. All native Sand Hills grass species with the specific rooting characteristics needed to penetrate and stabilize sand dune material. The germination happened slowly. Sand Hills native grasses germinate slowly by design. They have evolved in a moisture-uncertain environment and do not commit to above-ground growth until the root system is sufficiently established to survive a dry period. For 8 weeks after seeding, the blowout surfaces showed almost no visible change. The erosion blankets held. The sand did not move, and below the surface, the grass roots were beginning. Week 9. The first grass seedlings visible above the blanket surface. Week 12. The blowout faces covered in a thin but continuous grass seedling community. Dr. Elena walked the restored blowouts in September and was quiet for a moment. "These are establishing faster than I expected," she said. "The blankets held the moisture," I said. "And you didn't disturb them," she said. "Most people can't leave them alone long enough." And what I discovered in the center of the protected zone, after the windbreak had been growing for 2 years and the wind speed in the leeward area had dropped measurably, is something that Dr. Eleanor said she had never seen documented in Custer County before. Stay with me. 2 years after planting, The windbreak was not yet at full effectiveness. The trees were 4 to 5 feet tall, not the 15 to 20 feet of a mature windbreak, but the reduction in wind speed in the protected zone was already measurable. The anemometer I had mounted at the center of the production zone was reading average wind speeds 35% below the exposed conditions on the windward side. 35% below. Enough to make a difference. I had been preparing the production zone soil during the 2 years of windbreak establishment, incorporating organic matter into the sand hills sand to give it the water retention and nutrient holding capacity that pure sand lacks. Sand is almost inert as a growing medium. It has no organic matter, almost no nutrient holding capacity, and dries out rapidly after rain. Building it into something productive required sustained organic matter addition, composted cattle manure from Virgil's operation, cover crops incorporated in place, a drip irrigation system that kept the root zone moist without saturating the sand. The soil organic matter reading at the end of year 2 was 2.1%, up from essentially 0 at the start. Low by Iowa standards, extraordinary by Sand Hills sand standards. And in the soil, something had appeared that I had not introduced and had not expected. Earthworms, not many, 7 per cubic foot by my assessment, but present, which in a Nebraska sandhills sandy soil had a specific significance that Dr. Elena explained when I told her. The earthworms migrated from the native grass zones, she said. The organic matter you've been adding created conditions they could survive in. That's not nothing. That's a functional soil community establishing in material that doesn't normally support one. 7 earthworms per cubic foot in Nebraska sand hills sand. The wind-beaten wasteland was becoming soil. The first crop I chose for the protected production zone, and the specific reason I chose it over everything else that the improving sand hills soil could have grown, produced a result that brought a specialty food buyer from Lincoln to the farm personally. Stay with me. The sand hills of Nebraska have a specific agricultural heritage that most Americans don't know about. The region has been producing high-quality dry beans since the early 20th century, when farmers discovered that the well-drained sandy soil, the dry climate, the intense summer sun, and the cool nights of the high plains elevation produced dry beans with a specific flavor concentration and a low moisture content at harvest that made them exceptional for storage and cooking. Pinto beans, the specific variety that the Sandhills produces better than almost anywhere else in America, for the specific reasons of climate and soil that cannot be replicated in wetter, warmer, more humid growing environments. I planted pinto beans in the protected production zone in late May of year 3. The first year, the windbreak was providing meaningful protection. The planting was direct seeded into the drip-irrigated, organically amended Sand Hills sand, with a specific concern. Would the reduced but still present wind stress the plants at the pod set stage when wind damage is most harmful? The windbreak held. The pinto bean plants, short, bushy, drought-adapted by variety and by the sandhills conditions, established and grew and set pods with a vigor that the protected zone made possible. The plants were visibly different from what they would have been in the unprotected conditions. Fuller, less stressed, with more uniform pod development. I also planted a section of sandhills adapted sunflowers, not for oil production but for cut flower sales, using the tall, dramatic sunflower varieties that the Nebraska summer produces with an intensity of color and stem length that the high-altitude, high-UV conditions of the sandhills amplify, and a section of drought-adapted herbs, lavender, sage, thyme, perennial herbs that the well-drained sandy soil and the dry climate suit perfectly. The pinto bean harvest came in August. I sent samples to a specialty food buyer in Lincoln who sourced heritage dry bean varieties from small producers across the Great Plains. She drove to the farm. Something happened in September of the first full production year that I want to tell you about, because it was the moment I understood that what I had built on this wind-beaten Custer County wasteland was not just a farm. It was a demonstration of something that the entire Sandhills region had been waiting for someone to prove. Keep watching. The specialty food buyer from Lincoln, a woman named Carol, who had been sourcing Great Plains heritage food products for 12 years, walked the entire 38 acres with me on a September morning. She examined the windbreak establishment, the blowout restoration, the production zone soil improvement, the pinto bean harvest, the cut flower sunflowers, the herb section. At the production zone, she pressed her hands into the amended Sandhills soil. "This is sand," she said. "How are you growing beans in sand?" "Organic matter and drip irrigation," I said. "The sand drains perfectly. It just needs the water retention and the biology." She looked at the pinto bean harvest in the barn. "These are extraordinary," she said. She had been tasting them. "The flavor concentration. It's the climate, isn't it? The dry air and the cool nights." "And the soil," I said. "Sand has mineral properties that heavier soils mask. The beans are pulling from a different mineral profile." She contracted the full harvest. She added the lavender and sage to her sourcing list. She asked what I was planning to grow next season. I told her about the native Sandhills plum from the inner windbreak row, the shrubs that were establishing along the southwestern boundary, whose fruit is a specific wild plum variety native to the Nebraska Sandhills that produces small, intensely flavored plums used in jams and preserves that were historically a Sandhills household staple and that almost nobody was growing commercially. "Sandhills plum preserves," she said. "I haven't seen those in 15 years. "You will," I said. Year two's challenge arrived not as a wind event or a drought, but as something I had not anticipated. A decision by the Natural Resources Conservation Service that affected the funding I had been counting on for the windbreak expansion. And the way I found out about it at a conservation district meeting in Broken Bow is a story I think about every time I'm tempted to rely on external support for a project's critical path. The NRCS cost-share funding for windbreak expansion, a program that subsidizes tree planting on Sandhills properties for exactly the erosion control and agricultural protection purposes I was pursuing, was suspended for the program year due to a federal budget continuing resolution that delayed the agricultural appropriations bill. The funding I had budgeted for the expansion of the windbreak along the eastern boundary was not available. I sat in the meeting room in Broken Bow after the announcement and did the math on the back of my program. The eastern boundary expansion was not optional. The production zone's eastern exposure, currently unprotected, was the zone that the data showed was still receiving wind stress during the midsummer period when the northwest wind shifted to a more easterly component. Without the eastern expansion, the production zone would continue to be partially exposed during the most critical period of the pinto bean growing season. I drove home and made 3 decisions. The first, I would complete the eastern expansion with my own funds, staged over 2 planting seasons rather than 1. The NRCS funding would come back. It always did, but the windbreak could not wait. The second, I would reduce the production zone size for year 2 to the area with the best existing wind protection, accepting lower yield in exchange for lower risk. The third, I would use the forced reduction in production scale as an opportunity to improve the quality of what I was growing rather than the quantity. Smaller planted area, better management attention, higher quality per unit. The year 2 pinto beans from the reduced but better managed production zone graded higher on Carol's quality assessment than the year 1 beans. She paid a premium. The constraint had improved the product. The morning in year 3 when I walked the windbreak and realized that it had crossed the threshold from establishment to function. The morning I measured what the mature windbreak was doing to the wind in the production zone. Is the morning the whole project became something different. Stay with me. Year 3. April. The eastern red cedars in the outer windbreak row were 7 feet tall. The Siberian elms in the middle row were 12 feet. The native Sand Hills plum in the inner row was a dense shrub mass at 4 feet, exactly filling the gap between the cedar canopy base and the ground surface that Marcus had designed it to fill. I walked the windbreak from the northwest end to the southeast end and felt what it was doing. On the windward side, the full northwest wind at 22 miles per hour, the anemometer reading consistent with the historical average for April in Custer County. In the windbreak interior, the wind sound changed, quieter. The turbulence reduced by the permeable structure allowing controlled passage of air through the tree and shrub mass. On the leeward side, at the production zone, the anemometer reading was 9 miles per hour. 59% reduction. 59%. Marcus had promised 40 to 60 at maturity. The windbreak was at the upper end of the design specification in year 3. The production zone was a different place. Not still, the Sandhills is never still, but workable. The drip irrigation emitters were not being torn from their fittings by wind gusts during installation. The newly emerged bean seedlings were not being sandblasted at the soil surface. The cut flower sunflowers were standing straight rather than leaning permanently southwest under the constant wind pressure. Virgil drove by in May and stopped. He got out of his truck and walked to the windbreak. He put his hand on an eastern red cedar trunk, one of the trees that had been 18 inches tall when he first called them awful small. It was now 7 feet tall and as wide as his arm span. He was quiet for a long time. Then he said, "That's a windbreak." From Virgil, that was a substantial compliment. The first Sandhills plum harvest from the inner windbreak row, and what Carol said when she tasted the fresh plums before I processed them into preserves, is the moment that told me this farm had found its identity. Stay with me. Year 3. August. The native Sandhills plum shrubs in the inner windbreak row, the same shrubs that Marcus had specified for the gap-filling function of the windbreak design, had been establishing and spreading for 3 years. In year 3, for the first time, they fruited. Small plums, deep red, almost purple when fully ripe, the size of a large marble. The flavor, concentrated tart sweet, with the specific wild plum intensity that domesticated plum varieties bred for size and appearance have entirely abandoned, was extraordinary. The kind of flavor that makes you stop what you're doing and eat another one. I picked the first quart of ripe Sandhills plums on an August morning and drove them to Carol in Lincoln. She tasted one at the door of her office, standing in the parking lot, and was quiet for a moment. "I haven't tasted one of these since my grandmother's farm," she said. "She had a row of Sandhills plum along the windbreak. I used to pick them when I was a girl." She looked at the plums in the container. "People have forgotten these exist," she said. "I know," I said. "They shouldn't have," she said. She contracted the full year 3 plum harvest for preserves production. She named the product on her label, Nebraska Sandhills, Wild Plum Preserves, Custer County. The wind-beaten wasteland that Virgil said you couldn't farm for much was producing a product that Carol described as the most requested item in her entire Great Plains Heritage Food Catalog within 6 months of its release. The specific moment that completed the transformation of this Custer County, Nebraska wind-beaten wasteland, the moment I want to tell you about precisely, happened on an October morning in year 3 when Virgil came to the farm and asked me something I had not expected. October, year 3, the pinto bean harvest in the barn, the Sandhills plum preserves in production with Carol, the cut flower sunflowers finished for the season. The herb section, the lavender, sage and thyme, in their second year of establishment and beginning their first real harvest. The windbreak at 59% wind reduction, the blowout areas fully stabilized with native grass cover, the production zone organic matter at 3.2% from essentially zero. Virgil came on a Thursday morning, not driving past, driving to. He parked at the gate and walked the full property with me. The windbreak, the blowout restoration zones, the production zone, the barn with the pinto bean harvest, the herb section, the plum shrubs with their spent fruit clusters. At the windbreak, he stopped at the eastern red cedar row. "Third year," he said. "These'll be 15 feet in 3 more years." "Yes, sir," I said. At the production zone, he crouched and pressed his hand into the amended sandhill soil. "You've changed this," he said. "Organic matter and 3 years," I said. At the barn, he looked at the pinto bean harvest and the labeled herb bundles and the dried plum samples for Carol's production run. He was quiet for a long time. Then he said something I had not expected. "I've got 40 acres on my south section," he said. "Wind exposure. Always been marginal for cattle. I've been thinking about it." He looked at the windbreak. "Would you talk to Marcus for me?" he said. The forester. About a design. The rancher who had said the wind won't let you was asking for help to do what he had watched me do. The Wasteland was teaching the county. The wind is still here. I want to be clear about that. 38 acres of Custer County, Nebraska sand hills still has the same northwest wind that has been moving across this landscape for 10,000 years. The windbreak does not eliminate it. It manages it. That distinction is the whole story. The wind was never the enemy. It was the constraint, and every constraint has an engineering response, a specific designed, tested response that changes the relationship between what the constraint is doing and what you are trying to do. The windbreak changed that relationship. The blowout restoration changed that relationship. The organic matter addition changed that relationship. None of them defeated the wind. All of them found a way to work alongside it. The Sandhills plum, that Carol calls the most requested item in her heritage food catalogue, grows in the inner row of the windbreak. It is both the wind management tool and the product. The pinto beans grow in the wind shadow that the cedar and elm rows create. The lavender and sage grow in the protected zone's improved soil. The blowout areas that were eroding 3 years ago are now stable native grass, adding to the ecological diversity of a sandhills property rather than subtracting from it. The wind-beaten wasteland that Virgil said you couldn't farm for much is producing Nebraska sand hills, wild plum preserves that people in Lincoln are specifically seeking out, and heritage pinto beans that Carol grades as exceptional, and cut flower sunflowers that the Broken Bow Farmers Market sells out in a single morning. Virgil is planting his first windbreak this spring. The wind didn't lose. It just found out it had company. If this story of 38 acres of Nebraska sand hills and the wind that everyone said would stop it meant something to you, leave a comment below right now. Tell me, what's the constraint on a piece of land near you? Not the problem, the constraint. The thing that seems permanent, that everyone has accepted as the reason the land can't produce what it should. Because constraints have solutions, and the next farm on this channel is going to prove that again. Subscribe, hit the bell, come back next week, and tell me about your wind.